Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, Haylin, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Haylin Belay. Haylin, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So Haylin is a seasoned sex educator and health promotion professional with a focus in reproductive justice and intersectional trauma-informed strategies for healing and care. With over a decade of hands-on experience developing award-winning health education programming and providing professional development for clinicians, educators, and activists, Haylin has dedicated her life to teaching people of all ages practical skills for a healthier, more pleasurable life. In addition to her classroom work, she's also a yoga instructor and spiritual coach, offering workshops, trainings, and one-on-one coaching from a trauma-responsive, integrated mind, body, spirit perspective. And there's a lot more about what you do, but we'll get into that. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So before we get going, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah. So I was geographically was born in Washington State. I spent most of my adult years and career in New York City, and I'm currently based out of Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, okay. All right. So look, you are a very interesting person. I mean, obviously, looking at reading your bio, looking at your background, you've got a lot going on, and you're obviously very passionate. So when I say that to you, and when I ask you this next question, I'm curious what comes up for you. How did this all start for you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that you're not the first person to ask a version of that question. I think, especially in my early mid-career, when I was introducing what I do to people, they'd be like, what do those things have in common? How do those things all connect? My cheeky answer is that they all have me in common, and that I'm the connecting factor. Obviously, I'm interested in all of them, so they must have something in common. The less cheeky answer is that I was actually very lucky to find the thing that I was most passionate about at a very young age. I was, I think, 15 years old when I attended a queer youth activism camp. And that was the first time that I learned about social justice and these very important topics that I carry into my politics, but also is the first place where I had queer, inclusive, pleasure-based sexual health education. I grew up in Texas. In between Washington and New York was Texas. So in the state of Texas, obviously was not getting, I won't even say I wasn't getting quality sex education. I functionally was not getting sex education. And having the opportunity to get that in this explicitly political context, where alongside this health information, I was also being told, hey, there are reasons why you aren't getting this information in school that have nothing to do with health outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. The things that ostensibly health professionals are meant to be motivated by. And that just lit up a fire in 15-year-old Haylin that has not gone out of, at the time thinking, you mean the grownups knew this whole time, the information existed and they've been keeping it from us? How is that fair? How does that make sense? So it started off as, I think that everyone deserves to know this stuff, this information that's out there about how their bodies work, about what sexuality is and how they can embrace sexuality in their lives, again, in this queer, inclusive and pleasure-based way. And then as I started doing that work in my adulthood as a educator of young people, mostly K through 12 at that time, I found that I was running into a big problem, which was, I could tell my students all of the information in the world about, I could do all the condoms on banana demos that I want. Right. And if my students don't know how to talk to their partner about using condoms, how much have I really helped them? So that pushed me to the social emotional skills realm and sort of developing my skills in these things that are, so it's the Trauma Therapist podcast. I am not a therapist, but these things that are in the realm of psychoeducation, right? Helping people to understand their psychology so that they can better support themselves and make decisions for their own lives. And from the social emotional stuff, it became, well, I can give people these tools for how to communicate with their partner, but if they can't stay present long enough in their body to know what feels good, then how are they even going to know what to say to their partner? So there's another layer of having to go deeper. And that's what led me into becoming a yoga instructor, learning more about body work. And throughout all of this, that's the professional timeline. But at the same time, I was going through my own personal journey, as I think many trauma specialists are, unsurprisingly. In a lot of ways, it starts with a curiosity about myself and my own experience, trying to make sense of the world. And in college in particular, sort of a high impact trauma led me to kind of going back over the archives and recontextualizing things in my early childhood years. That was part of what led me to witchcraft, which is also a big part of my personal and professional practice. Witchcraft specifically as a, for me, it is a secular practice that's mostly based in radically reclaiming the idea that I know things and that I have power, which are two things that I think for a lot of trauma impacted people can be really hard to reclaim. So that's the sort of broad strokes of it. Is I was at 15 years old, I lucked out and figured out, actually, this is what I care more about than anything. And since then, it's all been about figuring out how to do that thing better and better.
That's fortunate, I think, and amazing that you were able to figure that out. So when you went to that camp, and how did you describe it? A queer
youth activism camp. That was the name of the camp.
So my guess is you had parents or people in your family who
No, actually, I had to request a special permission slip that did not have the word queer anywhere on it. And actually had a very touching experience when my mom came to pick me up from queer activism camp, where, going to my cabin, getting my stuff, and one of my compatriots is like walking towards me, and he's got a rainbow necklace on. And I'm like thinking in my head, like, oh my God, okay, what's my strategy here? What am I going to do? I turn to my mom and say, oh, Mom, this is, so-and-so, and turn back, and the necklace is already under the shirt. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was such a supportive environment to be in, of like, even though I did not come from a family where these conversations were discussed or these topics were encouraged around the dinner table, I was lucky enough to find a community of people outside of my family and some trusted adults outside of my family who were able to make that space for me.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you talked about kind of really struck me was, you can do all the banana demos, but if people can't actually talk to their partner. So what did you learn when you started thinking about that? What were you hearing? What were you not hearing? And what was going through your mind such that you said, okay, how can we maybe educate people in this way?
Yeah, I think it was twofold. So on the one hand, I've mentioned already that I was doing work in mostly middle and high schools at that time, talking to young people about, again, putting condoms on bananas and talking about healthy relationships. And I had a very striking experience in a workshop where I was talking to a group of high school students at an all-girls school. And we were talking about sexual decision-making, consent, communication, these kinds of topics. And there was a student in that class who sort of like raised her hand at one point and was like, well, in this theoretical scenario we're talking about, which at the time we were talking about, what is coercion? What does pressure look like in this realm? That this young person was like, well, if somebody says yes to something they didn't want to say yes to, it's kind of on them for not being able to withstand the game of the person that they're dealing with. And I was so knocked off my feet. I mean, at that time, I was in my early 20s. I was very optimistic that I would be going into classrooms where, of course we all are on the same page about what our sexual values are, and we just need to know how to do it. Mm-hmm. But realizing that a big part of what I was trying to teach people was not just the stuff that was, easy to put on a infographic or a piece of paper and say, here's the facts you need to know. It was actually something much deeper than throwing up some slides or showing some pictures, reading off statistics, and actually getting into a much deeper and richer type of conversation than I had been having with my students up until that point. That was really the impetus to going into developing my skill set as a social emotional skills educator. The other half of that equation, though, was in addition to all that stuff that I was doing, I also worked in sex shops for like on and off throughout my 20s. Lovely experience. Strongly recommend if anybody out there wants to be a sexuality educator, you will get no better practice than being on the floor, sales floor of a sex shop, because that's like the real sex education in terms of I'm talking to adults who think they know already, who think that they already have the answers to these questions, and realizing that these adults are, the grown-up versions of students who, and more often than not, didn't get good sex ed at the developmental period. So, the other impetus was also being in these ostensibly retail interactions that really were like educational conversations, and realizing it's not a matter of you don't know the information. Again, I'm talking to adults. You're having sex. You know what's up, allegedly. But there's still this big gap of, how do I know what I want and get what I want?
So going back to that person who said, if they say yes to a situation that they don't want, then that's on them. How did you respond? What did you say?
Yeah. So in that particular circumstance, I was at the disadvantage of, I believe this was like a 3 or 4 session series that I was doing as a visiting teacher. And that was one of our last sessions together. So I knew that to a certain extent, I wasn't going to be able to get to the depth that I would want to, ideally, with those young people. But what I ended up saying was, I think at the time, a version of like, I think my standard like go-to thing that in my back pocket of, okay, I hear you and I hear your perspective. For the sake of getting through the content that we're getting through today, I'm going to ask that you like come with us on the journey of what if that's not true. We can have a conversation later about what if it is true, but let's just, for the purposes of this workshop, let's say that maybe actually that's not let's not victim blame, essentially, is what a version of what I said. I think that was probably not the way that I would respond now. I think if I was in that same classroom now, 7 or 8 years on, I would have used that as an opportunity to ask a lot more questions, because I think that was actually a really rich opportunity for learning that at that time I saw as this is potentially an interruption to or an impediment to learning.
I think as a response that maybe a lot of people do have. What would you say now to that person?
Yeah. I mean, this is something I talk about when I do trainings with professionals around trauma-informed facilitation is I usually put a little slide up towards the end that's like question mark greater than exclamation point, right? Of like, if I can leave you with one suggestion for being more trauma-informed in your facilitation, it's ask more questions and try to be less reactive, because especially in these conversations for my work, right? Talking about sex, that's a topic where the best person might not be at their best, right? It's a sensitive topic. It brings up weird stuff for people. And knowing that, people need a space to work through those things, that just saying like, get that out of here, that doesn't belong here, it doesn't actually get them any closer to resolving it, has been, I think, the biggest shift in the way that I think about teaching now versus in my early days when it really was like, I have a lesson plan, I have to get through these key objectives or whatever. My perspective now is much more like, the job that I have here, yes, is to teach this content, but mostly is to help the people that I'm working with lead more pleasurable lives, be more sexually responsible. And if someone says that in a classroom that I'm in, that's my sign that actually, if that's what my mission is, that's what we got to talk about, and not like, all right, let's put a pin in that and come back to it later.
You were talking about working on the floors of sex shops and how what an amazing education that was for you. And look, I know, I realize everyone's different, but what did you discover? What are some of the things you heard?
I want to have like a fun, sexy story because I think, when I had sex educator on my business card at cocktail parties, people get excited and they want to hear the fun, salacious stuff. The really unfortunate truth is that a thing I was not expecting that I encountered a lot in the years that I worked in sex shops was that I would say more often than not, like more than 50% of the people that I was talking to at some point in the interaction would reveal that they had some kind of sexual trauma that they didn't think of as trauma, or had some really internalized, like toxic idea about sexuality that was, again, may or may not be my job to solve in this retail interaction, but that is coming up in this conversation. Because you have to imagine that, there's the version of coming to the sex shop that is so joyous, of like, it's a young girl who's like, I want to get my first vibrator and I'm nervous and her friend is with her. And it's all very like, you go girl, like we're going to, get you those orgasms. That's fun. That's delightful. Less fun is, the person coming in being like, do you sell like numbing creams because the things that my partner wants to do are physically uncomfortable for me? And instead of not doing them, like the appropriate thing seems to be, let me not feel the sex that I'm having.
Or not talk about it or share it, that it's even bothering me. Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Wow.
So it's, unsexy stuff happens at the sex shop all the time.
Right. So, like I said before, you obviously have this passion for this. What do you feel allows you to be this mediator, in a sense, that opens up discussions, that even allows people to confront what's going on for themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially because I started my career so young. It's hard not to think like, was it just a seed that was always going to blossom? Like, was I always going to pop out the womb and be like, let's talk about sex? I don't know. I mean, as I was alluding to before, it was not a result of growing up in a sex positive household. My mom to this day will insist that she's a virgin. And that's, in addition to me, she also has a 15-year-old. So that seems very unlikely. But, from that extremely conservative background, I think the natural curiosity that I had as a young person, and it might seem like a weird answer, but also my undiagnosed neurodivergence at that time, that I had a genre of curiosity that, because it was not diagnosed, my mom didn't have the tools to rein in the way that she might have wanted to, which actually made me, I think, able to not just like talk to people, but to have a type of curiosity that allowed me to be a really multidisciplinary learner, and to say, like, the thing that I'm interested in is sexuality. There's actually a million different entry points into that. There's all kinds of things that I can learn from all of these different arenas when it comes to, even beyond just sexuality, this concept of pleasure and what it means to live pleasurably. Mm-hmm. I've come to learn in retrospect that a lot of the problems I was trying to solve with that inquiry were the problems of undiagnosed neurodivergence. So, trying to find this self-understanding and to make peace with it, but not yet having the language of the DSM to kind of describe it for me.
So what's very interesting to me as we're talking, it seems like when you talk about sex, it's not just the physical act of sex. There's so many tangentials and topics that go into this. But let me that was just a comment here. So how does your neurodivergence play out? What does it look like for you?
Yeah. So I think, how do I want to answer this question? Because I could talk about this for an hour by itself. I'll say this. So when I talk about witchcraft in particular, frequently when I talk about witchcraft, I'm talking about it from, again, a secular perspective that's very body-based and very somatic-based. So talking about intuition as interoception and manifestation as efficacy. And from that perspective, many of the most powerful, intuitive, kind of natural witches that I know, people who are naturally attracted to things like tarot and to ritual and kind of intention and infusing the world around them with an intention, are neurodivergent people. I suspect that has to do with the fact that if you look at kind of all the things that are under the neurodivergence umbrella, which is a lot of different things, one thing that they tend to have in common is being exceptionally sensitive, right? Like a very sometimes overly receptive nervous system. And in the conception of intuition that I work with, that is very based on polyvagal theory and is very based on, again, the neuropsychology of what these experiences feel like. It doesn't surprise me then that the people who tend to be the most curious about, well, how do I reconcile the thing inside me that I know to be true and the conflict that I'm feeling from the outside world that maybe doesn't get my internal reality, tend to be people for whom it's harder to dissociate from those feelings, right? As a person of neurodivergent experience, when I have jobs that I can't tolerate being at, I throw up in the bathroom. Like I literally can't tolerate being there, right? And so it kind of forced me to have a different relationship with my feelings, my sensations, my body, because I don't have the same access as your quote unquote neurotypical person might have to like just turning those things off or down on a day-to-day basis. And that's why it brings me so much joy to share that with other people, because I think there are a lot of people for whom their distress is like just barely tolerable, right? And just barely tolerable means you can stay in that space for years and years and maybe your whole life. Is exceptionally sensitive, and saying, actually, there's a different way to do things that honors and protects that sensitivity is a really special, I think, role for me.
This might seem like a naive question, but do you approach speaking on the topic of sex differently with queer people or non-queer people?
That's not a naive question. I think it's a really good one. So again, I think this is something that at the beginning of my career, I might have answered differently. But there was a transition point. Frankly, I think of it as like around the time I hit 25, so about 10 years deep into thinking about these things, is when I feel like I started really getting it. And part of what really getting it meant for me at that point was that was also the time period at which I stopped teaching queer sex ed as a separate class, and instead making a point of saying all of the sex ed that I teach is queer inclusive. It is all being taught from a perspective of like queer people exist and are part of this conversation. And that being such an important thing, not just because queer people exist, that's obviously really important, but the other important piece being that people who don't identify as queer can still learn a lot about themselves by learning from this queer inclusive framework. I think a perfect example of that is talking about sexual anatomy. When you look at the development of the sexual organs, they're all analogous cells. There's really interesting and useful insight to be gained at looking at the analogous structures in different types of genitals, different types of bodies. That's something that if you're coming from a really narrowly like heterosexual penis in vagina kind of perspective of what sex is or what kind of sex education you need to offer, not only is that doing a disservice to the queer people in the room, it's doing a disservice to the ostensibly straight people in the room. It's also doing a disservice to the potentially closeted people in the room who maybe would not identify themselves openly as being queer, but are still, hungry for that information. So yeah, I think at this point there isn't a difference because at this point, I think I've matured into an understanding of, well, actually, none of this is that different, right? It's one of the reasons why I do so many different things that seemingly, quote unquote, don't have to do with sex. Well, they all have to do with sex. And that's where the manifesto on my website comes from, right? All people deserve an integrated life and the healthy pursuit of pleasure. And that integrated life piece means like your sex life isn't this separate secret thing that happens behind closed doors and has nothing to do with who you are at work or with your family or in your hobbies or whatever. You're the same person in all those spaces, and that's a big part of what I feel like my message is, my ministry is.
That's very interesting because I think for a lot of us there is a gap, a chasm, right?
Yes.
behind our bedroom doors and the face we show at work or at home. Talk about that. Yeah.
So I want to be clear that I do believe in boundaries, right? So right. Just saying that, we should all live integrated lives. I'm actually extraordinarily private about my sex life, even more so than other of my peers in the sexuality space for reasons that are my own. That to me is not in conflict with the idea of, but my sexual self is not a person that I put, in a closet or in a back room somewhere when I'm going about my day-to-day life. I think, again, I could talk about just this for an hour, but the most simple way that I think I can put it is from this. I'll give an illustrative example. So I was having a conversation with somebody about essentially a pattern they'd experienced in their romantic and sexual relationships, where they were sharing with me like, oh yeah, I've had lots of experiences where someone just like grabbed me and kissed me. And I was like, whoa, I don't think I've had, more than a couple of experiences like that. And they were really exceptional. And, kind of talking to them and being more curious. And, to make a long story short, part of what came out of that conversation was a realization that they had a very deeply embedded idea of like, well, consensual non-consent, or like what would I think in the common parlance be called like rape fantasy, of being like, well, I know that's not what I'm into. I hate that. I think it's gross. I'm very anti that conceptually. And then as we were talking, I was like, it kind of sounds like you have like a ravishment fantasy that you're really uncomfortable with. And because you're really uncomfortable with it, you don't look at it. And because you don't look at it, when you find yourself in circumstances where the ravishment fantasy is being fulfilled, it doesn't register to you that that's actually a dangerous situation, right? That it's like in this non-consensual situation, it actually kind of is, quote unquote, meeting a need for you, right? In this very shadowy kind of way. It's something that you want and that you like, but because you're so alienated from what you want and what you like, it makes it more difficult to distinguish between the safe version of that thing and the unsafe version of that thing. And I think you see versions of that with lots of different, whether it's like a specific kink or fantasy, or even just on a much more broad level, like the types of fantasy, non-sexual fantasies that we have about relationships. I think that's something that holds true, unsurprisingly, in a lot of places outside of the bedroom, that we think that we don't want something and find ourselves inadvertently kind of doing the thing because we're struggling to acknowledge the part of us that wants it.
No. So as we kind of wind down here, let's talk about your website. Do you offer trainings and workshops? And if so, what?
Yes. So I offer a whole bunch of things. At this last year, I've been focusing primarily on one-on-one work. But coming up in 2024, I'm going to be focusing more on doing trainings with fellow professionals, professional development type things. I have a few also just like open public group classes coming up this well, I guess February is not quite spring, but coming up in the next few months on topics related to like more of what I like to say is my magic trick of being like, come for this really sexy, fun topic. Surprise, it was psychoeducation the whole time. So I have a series coming up this next month on BD and DSM, which is about tabletop role playing and BDSM, and also is about internal family systems and like encountering the self. So that's kind of the perspective that the public classes take. When it comes to the other work that I do, I love working with, like coming out to work with a group of clinicians, practitioners, whatever. I also have a few self-paced programs that are available for, especially folks who are in some kind of trauma-related field where maybe the body piece or the somatic piece isn't an explicit part of the training that they're getting at their workplace. The Healing the Traumatized Body program that I offer is intended for also self-healers and civilians, shall we say. But I have heard from professionals and from practitioners that it's been really useful for filling in gaps for fields where that's not an explicit part of the conversation.
Okay. And the one-on-one work you do, how does that work?
Yeah. It takes a lot of different shapes. I sometimes default to calling it coaching because that's legible for people, but it's really not coaching. The more accurate terminology, I think, would be mentorship or apprenticeship, because coaching tends to be about like having external structure and kind of someone who's guiding you along that process. The way that I work with people one-on-one is much more like, I'm a person who's available to you on the journey that you are taking, right? And helping people to develop like, for example, one of the clients I'm working with right now, the main thing that we're working on is that she wants to develop a spiritual practice that feels authentically hers. Well, part of what that means from my perspective of what I do is I'm not chasing her down on a bi-weekly basis to say, hey, have you done your spirituality homework? Part of the work for her is figuring out, how do I authentically know when it's time for me to go to my spiritual mentor and have that conversation?
Okay. Haylin, we need people like you in the world. I feel like you have a certain courage and tenacity and mission that a lot of us don't. I mean, what you're talking about, let's face it, exists in the shadows culturally for us, socially for us, and I think the work you're doing is incredible and inspiring. You're welcome back here anytime.
Thank you very much. It'd be a pleasure to come back.
I appreciate it. All right. So what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So best way to find me is, it's nice to have a Googleable name, www.haylin.co. And that's where all of my everything is. If you want to, have me come speak at your school, if you want to chat one-on-one, if you have a question that you want to pop off in half an hour, I've got options for that too. And I do technically have Instagram. I will say this now, it's not the place where I'd want you to find me. You can follow me there if you want to. I hate Instagram. So that's not a place where I put my best stuff, I think. If you're looking for the good stuff, join the newsletter.
Okay. And we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Haylin, it's awesome meeting you, talking with you. Thanks so much.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.